The day Daniel Donnelly rode into Redemption Creek, he had a bullet crease along his left collarbone that was 3 days old, a conscience that was considerably older and considerably heavier, and absolutely no plan beyond finding water for his horse. That was the spring of 1882, a year when the Kansas plains still smelled like possibility and gunpowder in equal measure, and the little town of Redemption Creek existed in the sort of uneasy peace that comes when lawmen are few and outlaws are careful. It was a town of perhaps 400 souls, pressed between a limestone bluff to the north and the creek itself to the south, and it had the particular quality of a place that had survived several things it probably should not have survived, and had emerged from each trial a little more weathered and a little more determined. Daniel was 31 years old and looked older around the eyes. He had a face that might have been considered handsome under better circumstances, all strong jaw and dark brows and cheekbones cut sharp by years of insufficient meals. But there was something behind his eyes that made people uneasy, the way there is something uneasy about a window that has been broken and repaired too many times. He sat his roan horse with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more of his adult life in the saddle than out of it, which was true, and he wore his colt on his left hip, which told certain people certain things about him before he ever opened his mouth. 6 years. That was how long he had ridden with the Caswell outfit, though calling them an outfit was being generous in the same way you might call a brushfire a campfire. Wade Caswell had built his operation in the years just after the war, when the territories were still sorting themselves out, and a man with nerve and no particular moral architecture could carve himself a considerable living from the confusion. They robbed stages. They robbed banks. They rustled cattle when the opportunity presented itself, and the cattle were worth the trouble. Daniel had drifted into their company at 25, when he was angry and broke, and under the mistaken impression that anger and a steady gun hand were sufficient qualifications for a life, and he had stayed because leaving seemed impossibly complicated, and because Wade Caswell had a gift for making men feel that the world outside his orbit was more dangerous than the world inside it. The Caswell outfit was not a family. Daniel understood that now with the clarity that only distance provides. It had felt like one sometimes, particularly in the early years, around fires in the deep winter when the wind was vicious and the whiskey was warm. But families do not leave their wounded behind, and families do not turn on each other at the first sign of pressure from a marshal's badge, and families do not watch one of their own bleed out on a roadside while they argue about whether to ride back for him. That last one had happened to a man named Corey Brandt, who was 22 and had laughed easily and played the harmonica passably, and it had happened 8 weeks before Daniel rode into Redemption Creek, and it was the reason Daniel had ridden away from the Caswell outfit without looking back, which was also the reason he had the bullet crease, because Wade Caswell had very particular views about loyalty, and had expressed those views with a Winchester at approximately 400 yards. He was not a good man. He knew this. But he was perhaps a man who had not yet determined whether he was capable of becoming one, and that uncertainty was something at least. It was more than he'd had a month ago. He found the water trough at the end of Main Street and let the roan drink while he looked at the town, a general store, a hotel with a sign that had lost 2 letters to weather, a church with a white steeple that needed painting, a saloon called the Silver Buckle that was doing reasonable business even at 3 in the afternoon, a blacksmith's shop. And across from the blacksmith, a smaller building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read Finley Seed and Dry Goods, and beneath the lettering in smaller script, EST, 1878. He noticed the sign because a woman was hauling a crate of something heavy down from a wagon in front of it, and she was doing it with the particular determination of someone who has asked for help and been refused, or more likely has not asked because she has learned not to expect it. She was maybe 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical calico bonnet, and she wore a blue work dress that was clean despite clearly being a work dress, and she had flour on her left sleeve, and she hadn't noticed it or hadn't cared. Daniel watched her muscle the crate to the edge of the wagon bed and then pause, calculating. The crate was too heavy for one person of any size. He could see that from 30 yards away. He tied the roan to the trough post and walked across the street without entirely deciding to do so. "Can I help you with that?" he asked. She looked at him the way women in small western towns had learned to look at strangers, with a quick assessment that took in the gun belt and the trail dust and the collarbone that was clearly causing him some discomfort, and came to a conclusion that he could see in her eyes was not entirely favorable. "I've been managing crates since before I could vote," she said, "which I also cannot do, so I suppose managing crates is something I'm stuck with regardless." It was not yes and it was not no, and there was a dry humor in it that he had not expected. "I've got two working hands," he said. "The left one's a little slower than usual, but it's still attached." She looked at the way he was holding his left arm and something shifted in her expression, not sympathy exactly, but a kind of practical recognition. She stepped back from the crate. "Far end of that shelf inside," she said. "If you drop it, I'll charge you for whatever breaks." "Fair enough," he said. He managed the crate well enough, biting down on the discomfort from his collarbone with the ease of long practice, and he set it where she indicated on a shelf that ran along the interior east wall of a shop that was organized with a neatness that spoke of considerable effort and very limited space. There were seeds in paper packets sorted by type and arranged in wooden display frames. There were bolts of cloth, 3 different grades of canvas, lamp oil in sealed tins, coffee, sugar, flour in sacks, a modest selection of medicines and tinctures, a rack of tools. It was the kind of inventory that required real skill to maintain in a small town, where the supply lines were unreliable and the demand was unpredictable. "Thank you," she said, from directly behind him, and he turned to find her standing closer than he'd expected, looking at the shelf with an evaluating eye rather than at him. "You can go." "I'm Daniel Donnelly," he said. She looked at him then fully, with dark brown eyes that were very direct and not unkind, but were also not offering anything for free. "Dorothy Finley," she said. "This is my shop. Are you looking to buy something or just visiting?" "Passing through," he said, because that was what he'd thought when he rode in and he saw no reason to complicate it. "Most people who are passing through do not help carry crates," she said. "Most people aren't paying attention," he said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, more the precursor to one. "I need to get back to work," she said. "The hotel is 3 buildings down on the left. Sheriff Malone runs a quiet town, in case you're wondering." He was not sure if that was a warning or just information. He suspected both. "Noted," he said, and walked back out into the afternoon sun. He intended to water the horse, buy supplies, and ride on. That had been the plan. The plan required adjustment when the roan threw a shoe on the road out of town, which he discovered before he'd gone 300 yards. He turned back, found the blacksmith, and was informed that the man was backed up with work and could see to the horse no sooner than the following morning. He got a room at the hotel for 50 cents a night and told himself it was one night. He ate supper at the hotel dining room, which was run by a stout and efficient woman named Mrs. Haverson, who served a beef stew that was considerably better than anything he'd eaten in recent memory, and he listened to the town talk around him the way he had always listened in towns, carefully and without appearing to. The Finley shop was a topic. He gathered that the owner of Finley's Seed and Dry Goods was a widow of perhaps 2 years, that her husband Robert Finley had died of a fever and left her the business which he had started, and she had kept running through what people variously described as stubbornness, necessity, and a talent for the enterprise that nobody had apparently anticipated. There was some talk about whether the business was struggling. He couldn't tell if that was genuine concern or the particular satisfaction that small towns sometimes took in predicting failure. And there was considerable talk about one Harlan Greer, who was the owner of the only other general store in Redemption Creek, and who had, according to the table next to Daniel's, made Dorothy Finley an offer for her property that she had declined twice. Third time he asks, she'll have to say yes, one of the men at that table was saying, a man with impressive side whiskers and the confident tone of someone who has never run a business but has definite opinions about those who do. I wouldn't count on it, the other man said, sounding amused. She turned him down in front of 4 people last Tuesday, and the look on her face said she'd have turned him down in front of 40. Girl can't run that shop alone forever. She's not a girl, Potts. She's a woman with a business and a lease, and I'd remind you she's increased her seed inventory 3 times in 2 years, and now half the farmers east of town buy from her instead of Greer. Daniel took note of all of this and told himself it was none of his concern. In the morning his horse was not ready. The blacksmith, a large taciturn man named Hollies, said afternoon at the earliest, possibly evening. Daniel walked back to the hotel, reconsidered his finances, and went to Finley's to buy coffee and a paper packet of salt because he was nearly out of both and because there was no good reason not to. Dorothy Finley was behind the counter when he came in, writing in a ledger with the focused attention of someone who does their accounts every day because they cannot afford for the numbers to surprise them. She looked up when he came in, registered him without visible alarm, and said, "Back again." "Passing through is taking longer than expected," he said. "My horse threw a shoe." "Hollies is backed up," she said, returning to the ledger. "Coffee and what else?" "Salt," he said. "And whatever you think is worth buying." She looked up again, this time with frank curiosity. "That's an unusual purchasing strategy." "I've been eating trail food for 2 months," he said. "I'm open to suggestions." She put down her pen and studied him for a moment with those direct, dark eyes, and he had the uncomfortable sensation of being read, the way you read a ledger, looking for the discrepancy between what the numbers said and what the numbers meant. "Dried apricots," she said. "Hatch of them came in last week from a supplier in Santa Fe, and they're good. Better than what Greer's carrying. Also cornmeal if you're cooking for yourself, and I've got a tin of baking powder that'll keep, and pepper." "All of that," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You sure you're passing through?" "Working on it," he said. He watched her move around the shop gathering what he'd requested, efficient and unhurried, with the ease of someone who knew exactly where everything was and had organized it that way deliberately. She was not a soft woman. That was the wrong word for her, or rather, softness was not what struck him. She had a quality of being entirely at home in herself, of having decided a long time ago what she was and what she was for, and that decision showed in the way she moved and spoke, in the way she tallied his purchases without a paper and came to the correct total in her head and told him what he owed without hesitation. "You're good at this," he said before he decided to say it. She glanced at him while she was wrapping the apricots in brown paper. "At what?" "Running this. The shop. The way you've got it organized." She tied the paper with a length of twine, not looking at him. "My husband started it," she said, and there was no particular grief in her voice, but there was a careful neutrality that suggested the grief had been there and had been dealt with, which was different from not having existed. "He had a head for business and a terrible head for the bookkeeping side of it. I balanced the books from the start. When he died, I knew what we had and what we owed and what we needed to grow, and I just kept doing that." 2 years, he said. She looked at him then. "You were listening at supper last night." "I was," he said without apology. "Old habit." She seemed to weigh this and decide it was honest rather than threatening, which surprised him a little. Most people found the admission unsettling. "What kind of habit does a man develop that makes him a careful listener in a strange town?" she asked. He met her eyes. "The kind that comes from riding with people you can't entirely trust," he said, and he meant it more plainly than was comfortable, and she heard the plainness of it. He could tell by the way her expression changed, just slightly, the way you adjust when you realize a conversation has gone somewhere you hadn't planned. "Well," she said after a beat. The apricots are good. I wasn't recommending them just to make a sale." "I believe you," he said, and he paid her and took his purchases and left. Holly's finished the horse at 5 in the evening, and Daniel paid him, and stood in the late light with the roan beside him and thought about the road. Thought about where the road went. Thought about Wade Caswell and the Winchester, and the fact that Caswell had men in most of the territory, and had not forgiven a defection in 6 years of operation. Thought about Corey Brant left bleeding in a roadside ditch. Thought about what the road ahead actually offered him, concretely, when he tried to think of it. He could not think of much. He went back to the hotel and paid for another night and told himself he was resting the horse. The next 3 days had a quality of unexpectedness to them. He told himself each morning that he would ride out by noon, and each afternoon he found some reason that he had not. The roan needed rest after the thrown shoe. He wanted to make sure the collarbone was healing properly before he put a long ride on it. He'd heard there were men on the northern road who might be Caswell's, and the southern road added 2 days to wherever he was going, wherever that was. But the truth, which he examined with the uncomfortable honesty of a man who has recently decided to stop deceiving himself as a matter of personal policy, was that he kept finding himself in Finley's seed and dry goods. Not always to buy things, though he bought things. Sometimes just to pass the time in the way that seemed to happen naturally when Dorothy Finley was available to talk, which was not always, because she was frequently busy. But when she was not busy, or when the shop was quiet in the middle of the afternoon, she had a way of leaning against the counter with her ledger set aside and talking to him with the directness that he had noticed on the first day, and that continued to strike him as remarkable. She did not perform conversation. She did not offer the careful social softness that he associated with women, who had been taught that a man's comfort was their first obligation. She talked to him like an equal, which meant she also questioned him like an equal, and that required honesty, which was another thing he was apparently now committed to. She asked him what he'd done the 6 years he mentioned. He told her the shape of it without the specific details, because the specific details would have sent her reaching for the door, and he was not ready for that, though he told himself it was only because it would mean she'd send him away and he had not yet found anywhere else to be. "Riding for bad men," she said, and it was not a question. Her hands were still on the counter and her expression was thoughtful rather than frightened or disgusted, which was not the response he had expected. "Yes," he said. "And now you're not," she said. "Now I'm not," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "What changed?" He told her about Corey Brant, about the roadside, about the argument and the ride away. She listened without interrupting, which was a quality he was coming to appreciate deeply, the ability to listen to a thing fully before deciding what to do with it. "How old was he?" she asked. "The one they left." 22, Daniel said. Something moved across her face, quick and private. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it for Corey Brant and she also meant it for Daniel. He could hear both meanings in it. "That kind of thing changes a person." "I should have left sooner," he said. "I knew what they were. I told myself different stories about it, but I knew," she nodded slowly. "Most of us know the thing we're not supposed to be doing," she said. "Knowing it and doing something about it are not always the same day." He looked at her. "You speaking from experience?" "Everybody is," she said, and she picked up her ledger again, which meant the conversation was done. But she did it without coldness, just with the practicality of a woman who had a shop to run. He left and came back the next morning, and she gave him coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove in the back of the shop, and they talked about the seed trade, which was more interesting than he would have guessed, and about the weather patterns along the creek, and about a dispute between 2 farmers east of town over a property line that had been going on for 8 months, and that Dorothy had opinions about that were both detailed and entirely correct, as far as he could tell. On the 4th day, Harlan Greer came into the shop while Daniel was there. Greer was a broad man in his late 40s with a prosperous gut, and the air of someone who had decided very early in his life that being the largest presence in any room was a form of authority. He wore a good coat and a silver watch chain, and he looked at Daniel with the particular displeasure of a man encountering an obstacle he had not scheduled. "Mrs. Finley," he said, addressing Dorothy without looking away from Daniel, "I was hoping to have a word." "You're having several," Dorothy said pleasantly, not moving from her position behind the counter. "Mr. Donnelly, this is Harlan Greer. He owns the general store on the east end of town. Mr. Greer, this is Daniel Donnelly, who is a customer." Greer looked at Daniel with an assessment that was not subtle. "Passing through," he said. "For the moment," Daniel said, which was the most honest thing he could have said. Greer turned to Dorothy. "I've been thinking about the offer," he said. "On the property, I'm prepared to go to $900. "That's generous," Dorothy said in the tone of someone who is about to be ungrateful for a generous thing. "But the answer is still no." Greer's jaw tightened. "Dorothy, this is not a sustainable situation. You're one woman running a shop in a town with 2 hard winters behind it and another likely coming, and the northern road is going to be cut by the railroad company within the year, which means your supplier route changes or disappears. I'm offering you a way out before the situation becomes something you can't recover from." "I appreciate the analysis," Dorothy said, "but I've been doing my own. My supplier route from Santa Fe is better than the northern road and has been since last fall. The railroad is buying right of way on the eastern side of the creek, not the northern road. And I've already spoken to Josiah Hartwell about the seed contracts for spring, which would add 40% to my dry goods revenue, so my situation is not what you've diagnosed it to be." Greer was quiet for a moment. His jaw was still tight. He looked at Daniel again, as if Daniel were somehow responsible for this, which Daniel thought was interesting. "Think about it," Greer said to Dorothy. "The offer stands for another month." "I'll be sure to decline it again before the month is out," Dorothy said warmly. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Greer." After he had gone, Dorothy let out a breath that was not quite a sigh but was something adjacent to one, and she stood very still for a moment with her hands on the counter. And Daniel could see that the composure had cost her something, not the argument. She had clearly won the argument without effort, but the continuing nature of the thing, the having to do it again and again, the wearing quality of being a woman alone in a position that other people were certain she could not hold. "He's wrong about the railroad," he said. "Completely," she said. "I have it in writing from the county surveyor's office." She paused. "I asked for it specifically because I knew he'd use it as an argument." "You're ahead of him every step," Daniel said. "I have to be," she said simply, and then she looked at him with a directness that he was beginning to associate specifically with moments when she was about to say something that mattered. "Are you actually leaving this week?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said, which was the first completely honest answer he had given to that question. She studied him. "Redemption Creek could use a man who's careful and can carry a crate," she said. "Sheriff Malone has been trying to find a deputy since the last one left in January. It pays $12 a month, which is not wealth, but it's $12. He looked at her. "Are you recommending me for a job?" "I'm mentioning that a job exists," she said. "What you do with the information is your own affair." He thought about Wade Caswell. He thought about the fact that Caswell's men had been reported in the territory, that one of them, a man named Reeves who had a long memory and a longer reach, knew Daniel's face and knew he had ridden south after leaving the outfit. He thought about the logic of staying visible in a town with a sheriff when you were a man being looked for by men who operated outside the law's attention. He also thought about the way Dorothy Finley looked when she was being too composed, and the fact that she had apparently thought enough of him to mention the deputy position, which was not nothing. He went to see Sheriff Malone that afternoon. Malone was a lean man of 50 with a gray mustache and the patient eyes of someone who has dealt with a great many human crises and has learned that most of them resolve themselves if you wait long enough and position yourself carefully while waiting. He listened to Daniel's application for the deputy position with a stillness that was very like Dorothy's, and then he said, "Donnelly, you've been in town 4 days. Why?" "Horse threw a shoe," Daniel said. Then I found reasons to stay. What kind of reasons? Daniel met his eyes, honest ones. Malone was quiet for a long moment. He had a way of using silence that reminded Daniel of a card player, the kind who wins by making you wonder what he knows. You're carrying that gun left-handed, he said. Most men don't do that by preference. Most men haven't made the choices that made it necessary, Daniel said. Can you be specific? I rode for Wade Caswell for 6 years, Daniel said. I left 8 weeks ago. He put a bullet along my collarbone as a farewell. I've been riding south since. Malone absorbed this without visible reaction, which was either the sign of a very good lawman or a man who had already heard enough about the world that very little surprised him anymore. Caswell, he said. I know the name. Most people in the territory do, Daniel said. Why'd you leave? Daniel told him about Corey Brandt. Malone looked at the desk for a moment. Then he said, you understand I'd have to write to the U.S. Marshal's office. Check if there are warrants on you specifically. I'd expect nothing less, Daniel said. That takes 2 to 3 weeks, Malone said. In the meantime, you're willing to work on a provisional basis, unpaid, and if the marshal comes back with warrants, you surrender yourself and face the proceedings. Yes, Daniel said. And if he comes back clean, then $12 a month sounds reasonable, Daniel said. Malone looked at him for another long beat. Then he opened a drawer and laid a deputy's badge on the desk between them, the kind of badge that was brass and dented and had been worn by at least 3 previous men. Don't embarrass me, he said. Daniel picked it up. I'll do my level best, he said. He went back to Finley's and stood in the doorway, and Dorothy looked up from her ledger and saw the badge, and something moved in her expression that he could not fully identify, something that had warmth in it and also something else, something more careful. Sheriff Malone moves fast when he wants to, she said. Provisional, he said, until the marshal writes back. She nodded, looking at him steadily. Are you worried about what the marshal will say? Some, he said, but mostly no. I was there, I know what I did and what I didn't do. There are things I'm not proud of. There are no warrants on me that I know of, because Caswell was careful about keeping the men off the official records where he could. It was better for him that way. She nodded again, slowly. Then I hope the marshal agrees with your accounting, she said. And then in a different register, practical and matter of fact, Mrs. Haverson's roast chicken on Friday nights is the best thing this town produces. You should plan accordingly. He smiled, and it was an expression that felt slightly unfamiliar on his face, like a room that had been closed for a long time and was being opened to air out. I'll plan accordingly, he said. The weeks that followed had a quality of dailiness that Daniel had not experienced in so long that he had forgotten it was something to want. He slept in the same room every night. He ate at the same table. He walked the same streets on the rounds that Malone had outlined for him, morning and evening, through a town that was learning his face and tentatively deciding what to do with him. He helped a man named Gus Reinhardt move a fallen section of fence after a storm. He sat with an elderly woman named Mrs. Cho while her husband was sick, and she needed someone to fetch the doctor, which he did, 3 times in 1 week. He broke up a dispute between 2 cowhands outside the Silver Buckle that had not yet become a fight but had been demonstrating intentions, and he did it without drawing his gun, which earned him a particular kind of quiet respect from the men who saw it. And he saw Dorothy Finley every day. Not always for long. Sometimes just in passing on his morning round, when she was opening the shop and he was starting his circuit. Sometimes in the afternoons when the town was quiet, and she would come to the door with 2 cups of coffee and lean against the door frame and talk to him about whatever the town was presenting that day. She had a mind that moved fast and found connections between things that he would not have connected, between the price of wheat in Kansas City and the decisions a farmer would make about what to plant in the spring, between the patterns of weather and the kind of credit she could offer and still stay solvent. She talked about the shop the way other people talked about something they loved, not rapturously, but with the intimate knowledge of deep familiarity. He told her things in return. Not the Caswell years, not the details, but his own shape. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about a father who had worked himself to death in a quarry, and a mother who had lasted 4 years longer and no longer than that, about being 17 and alone, and making the sequence of small wrong turns that had eventually led him to Wade Caswell's fire in the winter of 1876. He was surprised by how easy it was to tell her these things, and he understood, thinking about it, that it was because she listened without performing sympathy, the way she listened to everything, which made you feel that what you were saying was being actually heard rather than socially accommodated. She told him things, too, about growing up in Ohio with a schoolteacher father who had put a book in her hand before she could walk, and had been unable to understand why the world would not simply recognize that she was as capable as any man and compensate her accordingly. About meeting Robert Finley, who had been a good man with a warm laugh and an absolute inability to keep accounts, and who had looked at her ledger skills with an admiration so pure it had felt like love, which it had turned out to be, in a gentle, steady way. About his death, which had been fast and had come with very little warning, a fever that had taken him in 9 days. About the first month after, which she described briefly, and with a care that told him the brevity was protection. About the decision to keep the shop, which everyone had told her was wrong and which had turned out to be the right choice, which she did not say with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had trusted their own judgment and been vindicated. "Did you ever think about leaving?" he asked one afternoon in early May, when the creek was running high and the apple trees behind the church were beginning to blossom. "Going back to Ohio, or somewhere else entirely?" "Every week for the first year," she said. "And then one morning I woke up and I had an idea about seed display that I wanted to try, and I realized I had been thinking about the shop in my sleep. After that, I knew I was staying." "What was the idea?" he asked. She looked at him with the slightly surprised expression she occasionally wore when he asked about the shop rather than around it. "Organizing the seed packets by planting season instead of by plant type," she said. "So farmers could look at the spring section and see everything they needed to plant in one place, instead of hunting through alphabetical categories. It sounds simple, but it increased my seed sales by 1/3 in the first 2 months." "That's not simple," he said. "That's understanding how your customers think." She smiled at that, fully and without reserve, and it was one of the few times he had seen her smile without the careful quality that was her default register, and it hit him somewhere below the chest with a force that was both entirely unexpected and, in retrospect, probably inevitable. He was in love with her. He understood this with the same quiet certainty with which he had understood, 8 weeks before, that he could not stay with the Caswell outfit one more day. Not a dramatic realization, not a sudden flood, but a recognition, the way you recognize a landmark you've been riding toward without knowing it. He did not tell her. He had no right to tell her, not yet. He was a man with a provisional badge and an uncertain past, and a former employer somewhere in the territory who wished him actively ill. He was a man who had spent 6 years making wrong choices and was approximately 6 weeks into trying to make right ones. He was not going to put that on Dorothy Finley's door and ask her to open it. But he stayed. That was the part he could do. He stayed. The marshal's letter arrived on a Thursday in late May, 3.5 weeks after Malone had written. Malone read it in his office with Daniel sitting across the desk, and then he set it down and said, "No warrants. Your name appears in the investigation file for 3 Caswell jobs as a possible associate, but there is no indictment, and the investigator's note says your departure from the outfit is documented, and there is no evidence of direct participation in the specific charges being pursued." Daniel let out a breath. "You're clean," Malone said, and pushed the dented brass badge across the desk. "You want to make it official?" "Yes," Daniel said. Malone shook his hand, which was the most demonstrative the man ever was, and that was enough. He was at the door of Finley's within the hour, and Dorothy looked at his face when he walked in and said, "Good news." "Clean record," he said. "Official deputy." She came around the counter and offered her hand, which he took, and her grip was firm and warm, and she held it a beat longer than a handshake required and looked at him with those dark, direct eyes with something in them that he was beginning to, cautiously, read. "I'm glad," she said, and meant it thoroughly. "Dorothy," he said, and then stopped, because he had not planned this and he was not a man with practiced words for this situation. "Yes," she said, still holding his hand, though she had to be aware she was still holding it. "I'd like to take you to supper," he said. "Not at Mrs. Haverson's. Somewhere that's just the two of us if there is such a place in this town. There is not a restaurant in Redemption Creek that has a table for two that is not visible to at least 4 other people," she said, with the dry honesty that he had come to love. "But there is a picnic spot along the creek where the cottonwoods are thick enough to make you feel private, and I make a cornbread that is considerably better than Mrs. Haverson's, though I would never say so where she could hear me." "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," she said. She let go of his hand then, and went back to her side of the counter, and picked up her ledger. But the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it sometimes did, the precursor to a smile that she had not quite let all the way out, and he watched it for a moment and then left, because he was grinning too much to conduct any kind of serious conversation, and he needed the walk to put his face back in order. Saturday was warm and wide open, the kind of May day that Kansas occasionally produces as if apologizing for its winters, all blue sky and light wind, and the smell of creek water and cottonwood blossoms. Dorothy brought the cornbread and cold chicken and dried apricots, which made him laugh when he saw them, and she smiled at his laugh with the fullness she reserved for moments when she was genuinely pleased, and they sat on a flat rock by the creek, with the water running clear and fast below them, and ate and talked, until the afternoon started going golden at the edges. He told her about Missouri the way he had never told anyone, the good parts, the river in summer and his mother's voice, and the one teacher at the county school who had thought he had a mind worth cultivating, who had given him 3 books that he'd carried for years after everything else was gone. He told her about those books, what was in them, what he had thought of them. She listened with an attention that was vivid and complete, asking questions that went exactly to the things he'd thought were the interesting questions, which was one of the most disarming things a person could do to him. She told him about her father's library, about reading everything in it twice, and then corresponding with the county lending library for more, about arriving in Kansas territory as a bride of 19 with 2 trunks of which one was entirely books, which Robert Finley had found the funniest and most endearing thing he had ever seen. "Did you keep them?" he asked. "After he died?" "Every one," she said. "The shop has a small back room and half of one wall is shelves. I added 12 more in the last 2 years. "Which ones are you reading now?" he asked. She told him, with an enthusiasm that was different from her practical manner, lighter and more unguarded, and they argued productively about a novel they had both read in different years and had different readings of, and the sun was fully gold, and the shadow of the cottonwoods was long across the creek before either of them noticed the time. "I should get back," she said, without moving. She was sitting with her knees drawn up and her bonnet set aside, which she'd done an hour ago when the shade made it unnecessary, and her dark auburn hair was partly escaping its pins in the way it did, he had noticed, whenever she'd been in motion or animated, and she looked in the late afternoon light like something he had no right to be this lucky to be sitting next to. "Dorothy," he said. She turned to look at him, close and quiet. "I'm not passing through any more," he said. "I want to be plain about that." She held his gaze steadily. "I know," she said. "I want to keep sitting next to you for a considerable amount of time," he said. The corner of her mouth moved, but this time the smile came all the way out full and warm, and she said, "You are the most cautious person at declaring themselves that I have encountered in my adult life." "I'm being careful," he said. "You deserve careful." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that he could not entirely read, but that had something moved in it, something that was past the careful border she usually kept. "Yes," she said. I think I do. And then, softer, I'd like to keep sitting next to you too, for a considerable amount of time. He reached out and took her hand, which was the most audacious thing he'd done since pinning on the badge, and she looked down at their joined hands on the flat rock and then back at him, and the smile remained, and the water ran by below them, and the cottonwood blossoms floated down in the golden light. And that was the moment he would remember for the rest of his life as the one when everything changed from possible to real. The summer moved through Redemption Creek the way Kansas summers do, with a heat that was total and unashamed, and a beauty that was all horizontal, all that enormous flat sky and the sun burning white at noon, and the evenings cooling to something almost gentle. Daniel learned the town the way you learn a place you intend to stay in, not the surface geography but the deeper map, who owned what and owed whom, and where the tensions ran underground. He was good at the deputy work, better than he had expected, partly because 6 years with the Caswell outfit had given him an education in how men on the wrong side of things thought, which was useful information when your job was preventing those things. He and Dorothy fell into a pattern that was comfortable and grew more comfortable without losing its excitement, which is the particular alchemy that happens when the person you want to spend time with is also the person who continues to interest you the more time you spend. They had supper together 3 times a week, sometimes at Mrs. Haverson's and sometimes at Dorothy's, which she cooked with the same organized competence she brought to everything. And sometimes they walked along the creek in the evenings when the heat had gone out of the air, and the stars were coming up thick and low the way they do in Kansas, where the sky is so wide there is room for all of them. He kissed her for the first time on a Tuesday evening in June, on the road back from the creek walk under the last of the daylight, and it was as unhurried as everything he did with her, careful and certain at the same time, and she kissed him back without reserve with her hands coming up to his face in the dark. And when they separated she said, very quietly, "I was beginning to wonder," and he laughed against her temple and said, "I was being careful," and she said, "I know and I appreciate it. And you can stop now." He stopped being so careful, which is to say he started simply showing how he felt, which came more easily than he'd expected, perhaps because she made it easy, with the directness of her own feeling, and the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention, which he was always paying attention. But he let her think otherwise because the look itself was worth more to him than the catching of it. Through July, she told him that his presence had changed certain things about the shop, which puzzled him until she explained. Harlan Greer had stopped coming in with his offers. Not because Daniel had said anything to him, but because Greer was a man who evaluated situations, and the situation in which Daniel Donnelly was a fixture in Dorothy Finley's life, and also happened to be the town's deputy, was a situation that Greer had decided was not worth the effort. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "That his stopping might be about you rather than about me." "Does it bother you?" he countered. She considered. "It would bother me more if I thought you'd done something to engineer it," she said. "But you haven't. You've just been here, and here has apparently been enough to change the calculation. I'll accept that." "You'd have handled Greer regardless," he said. "Yes," she said, "but it's nice to be handling him toward the same outcome with fewer resources expended." He smiled at the way she put things. He was always smiling at the way she put things. In August, something happened that changed the quiet. A rider came into town from the north, a man with a sorry-looking horse and the particular wariness of someone who had been riding hard and watching his back. He went directly to the Silver Buckle, and Daniel, on his evening round, noticed the horse outside and went in and found the man at the bar having a whiskey with the speed of someone self-medicating. The man's name, once Daniel had introduced himself and the badge had done its work, was Roy Fitch, and he was a small-time rancher from up near Dodge City who had had a run of bad luck with his cattle, and had been approached by what he described as a large, organized outfit looking to buy his land for a price that was deeply below market, and had been presented in a way that made clear the price was not negotiable. Daniel asked for a description of the outfit's representative. Roy Fitch described a man with light eyes and a scar through his left eyebrow, which was a description of a man named Garrett Reeves, who was Wade Caswell's second, and who was apparently working Caswell's particular brand of land acquisition along the northern stretch of the territory. Daniel felt the cold settle in his chest. He kept his face even. He asked Fitch more questions, careful ones, about where and when and the specific direction Reeves had come from and seemed to be moving toward. The answers suggested Caswell's operation was working south, which meant Redemption Creek was not necessarily in the path, but it was within a reasonable radius, and Reeves in particular was someone who carried a personal list. He went to Malone that evening and told him everything. Malone listened with the patience that was his defining characteristic and then said, "You think they'll come here?" "I think Reeves will," Daniel said. "Eventually. He knows I came south. It's only been 3 months. He's patient, but he's also thorough." "How many men does Caswell typically send with Reeves on a job?" "Depends on the job. For something personal, sometimes just 1 or 2. For the land work he's doing more, 5 to 8. Malone was quiet. "I've sent for a territorial circuit marshal before, but that takes time I'd prefer not to need." "I can write to them directly," Daniel said. "I have information about Caswell's operation that would be useful to them. I could offer it in exchange for some presence in this area." "Do it," Malone said. "And in the meantime, I want to know if you see anything that looks like Caswell's men within 10 miles of this town." Daniel wrote the letter that night, at the desk in the sheriff's office. 3 pages of detailed information about the Caswell outfit's methods and locations and personnel. The kind of information that only came from 6 years on the inside. And he sealed it and sent it on the morning stage, and then went about the business of his day. He did not tell Dorothy immediately, and then he decided that was wrong and told her that evening. Because she was a woman who operated in this town and who deserved to know the risks that were in the territory. And because he had decided that not telling her things to protect her from worry was exactly the kind of decision that would erode what they had. She listened to him tell it, sitting at the table in her kitchen behind the shop, with her hands around a cup of tea and her face carefully composed. When he finished, she said, "Is he the same man who shot you in the collarbone?" "That was Caswell himself," he said. "Reeves is the one who organized most of the jobs. He has different reasons to be unhappy with me." "What reasons?" He told her about a specific incident 2 years ago, when he had refused to follow through on an order that would have hurt a family in their homestead, that he had not followed it through, and had lied about why, and that Reeves had always suspected the truth of it. She looked at him across the table. "You protected them," she said. "I left them their property and told them to ride out," he said. "It's not the same as being good." "No," she said, "but it's not nothing either." She set down her cup. "What do you want to do?" He looked at her. "Stay," he said. "Work the problem. Try to make sure Caswell's operation doesn't get any closer to this town than it already is." She nodded slowly. "Then that's what we do," she said, and the "we" was deliberate. He could hear it, and something in him that had been braced for the conversation softened completely. "You're not frightened," he said. "I'm a little frightened," she said, with her characteristic honesty. "But frightened doesn't mean I'm going to run you off or board up the shop and hide under the floorboards. I made a decision about you, Daniel. I made it with my eyes open. That doesn't stop being true because the situation is inconvenient." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her palm up and held his, and they sat like that in the quiet kitchen for a while, with the lamp burning low between them. September brought the first cool edges into the mornings, and a letter from the territorial marshal's office, acknowledging Daniel's intelligence report, and indicating that they were already building a case against the Caswell operation, and that his information was valuable, and that a deputy marshal would be assigned to the area within the next month. It was not as fast as Daniel would have preferred, but it was something solid. In the meantime, there was a town to run and a business to support, and an autumn that was, despite everything, one of the best Daniel had known in his adult life. He helped Dorothy with the shop in his off hours, which she allowed not because she needed the help, but because she had observed that he was genuinely interested in the operation and had ideas that were sometimes good. He built her 2 additional display shelves from salvaged lumber, with a care for the joinery that surprised her, and she told him she hadn't known he could do that, and he told her there were a few years before Caswell when he had worked for a builder in Missouri and had learned enough to be useful. "You have more past than you've told me," she said, looking at the shelves. "Everybody does," he said. "Tell me more of it," she said. He told her more of it. She told him more of hers. That was the fall, an accumulation of stories traded in the evenings and the quiet afternoons, the adding of detail to a picture that had begun in outline and was filling in towards something complete. The deputy marshal arrived in early October. His name was James Whitmore, a compact, quiet man in his early 40s who shook Daniel's hand with a grip that said he'd read the report carefully and had decided to trust the man behind it. Whitmore set up in the sheriff's office alongside Malone and Daniel and laid out what the territorial office knew about Caswell's current operation, which was more than Daniel expected, and incorporated what Daniel told him, and from those 2 bodies of knowledge, they assembled a clear picture. The Caswell outfit was working south. They had 2 confirmed locations where they were conducting the same land pressure operation they had done to Roy Fitch and to a dozen others over the summer. Reeves was the point man. And Reeves was, confirmed by multiple witness accounts, heading in the direction of the Southern Territory, which included the area around Redemption Creek. "You're a target," Whitmore said to Daniel, not unkindly. "I want to be honest about that. Reeves has been asking about you at stops along the northern route." "I know," Daniel said. "My recommendation is that we let him come, but on terms we control," Whitmore said. "We know he's coming. He doesn't know we use that." "What do you need from me?" Daniel asked. "Your knowledge of how he operates," Whitmore said. "And when he gets here, I need you to stay calm and let the law handle the confrontation." "That's exactly what I want," Daniel said. Malone looked at Daniel. "You all right with this?" "Yes," Daniel said, and he meant it. 6 years ago, he would have ridden to meet Reeves himself, on the old terms, man to man, the way disputes were settled in the Caswell outfit. He did not want that anymore. He wanted the law to do its work. He was the law now, as improbable as that still sometimes seemed when he caught his reflection in a window with the badge on his chest. He told Dorothy that Reeves was coming toward the territory. She received this with the same steadiness with which she had received everything, and then she said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing," he said. "Stay in the shop. Don't alter anything about your normal day. The worst thing we can do is act like something's different." "I can do that," she said, and then with a quietness that was different from her usual directness, more careful, more deliberate, "Daniel, when this is done, I want to talk to you about something." He looked at her. "About what?" "After," she said. "When this is done. I don't want to say it now because I want to say it cleanly without this thing sitting over us." He felt something move in his chest. "All right," he said. "After." Reeves and 2 men arrived in Redemption Creek on a Thursday morning in late October, when the leaves along the creek were gold, and the air had the specific cold clarity that comes to Kansas in the fall. Daniel saw them from the south end of Main Street on his morning round, and had his hand on the badge and his heart beating steady and fast, and he walked to the Silver Buckle, where Whitmore and Malone had positioned themselves inside with 3 additional deputies borrowed from the county, and he knocked the signal pattern they had arranged. Reeves came out of the Silver Buckle with the confidence of a man who expects to control any room he enters, and found instead Whitmore's badge and Malone's badge, and 4 guns making a careful geometry around his position. His 2 companions were taken separately, quickly, and without injury to anyone. Reeves himself stood very still, looking at the badges and then at Daniel, who stood at the edge of the perimeter with his hand on his Colt. "Donnelly," Reeves said, in a voice that was almost conversational. "Reeves," Daniel said. "You look like a lawman," Reeves said. "I am one," Daniel said. Reeves looked at the badges again, at Whitmore specifically. "You're federal," he said. "United States Deputy Marshal James Whitmore," Whitmore said pleasantly. "Garrett Reeves, you're under arrest on charges including extortion, theft, and conspiracy in violation of federal statutes. You'll come with us." Reeves went. He had the particular resignation of a man who understood the arithmetic and found it unfavorable, and he did not make any dramatic movements, which Daniel had half expected him to, because Reeves at his core was a calculator rather than a romantic about violence. He went quietly, and his two men went quietly, and it was over within 10 minutes in the October morning, which was anticlimactic in the best possible way. Whitmore took them on the noon stage with the additional deputies. Before he left, he shook Daniel's hand again and said, "The case against Caswell is going to take another 6 months to close, but with what you've given us and what Reeves will eventually deal to get a lighter sentence, we'll have it. You've done good work." Daniel watched the stage go and then stood in the middle of Main Street for a moment in the October sun, feeling something he could not entirely name, a kind of lightness, the particular lightness of something being set down that you have been carrying for a very long time. He walked to Finley's Seed and Dry Goods. Dorothy was in the doorway when he came up the street, as if she had seen the stage go and was waiting to see what came next. She looked at his face and read it, the way she read everything, quickly and accurately, and the tension in her own face released. "It's done," he said. "Come in," she said. She put the coffee pot on and he sat in the chair she kept behind the counter for moments when the shop was empty and she was doing her accounts, which she had offered him so many times it had become his chair, and she made the coffee and poured 2 cups and came around to lean against the counter beside him, which was her chair, so to speak, the standing position beside the counter that she occupied the way a captain occupies a deck. "You said you wanted to talk," he said. "After." She held her cup with both hands and looked at him with the direct regard that he loved, that he had loved from the very first day when she had looked at him across a crate and assessed him without softness or pretension. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what this looks like, going forward, you and me." "Tell me," he said. "I'm not someone who does things by half," she said. "I never have been. I kept this shop because I knew it was right and I worked at it completely, not with one eye on the door. When I care about something, I'm all the way in." She paused. "I care about you, Daniel. I'm all the way in. I want to know if you are too." He put down his cup and stood up, which brought him very close to her in the narrow space behind the counter, and she looked up at him with those dark eyes that were entirely unguarded in a way they very rarely were, and he thought about the road out of town the day the roan threw the shoe and what would have happened if he just kept walking, and the thought was so cold and so final that it clarified everything. "Dorothy Finley," he said, "I rode into this town with nothing but a bullet crease and a horse with a thrown shoe and the sincere intention of riding out again, and I have not ridden out because you are the first right thing I have found in 6 years of looking in entirely the wrong directions. I am all the way in. I have been all the way in since the day you told me the apricots were good, and you weren't just saying so to make a sale." He paused, and this was not a dramatic pause. It was the pause of a man making absolutely certain of what he is about to say. "I would like to marry you, if you'll have me." I understand that's a considerable thing to ask of a woman who has a shop and a life she built without any help, and I am not asking because I think you need anything from me. I'm asking because I cannot imagine the ongoing project of being alive and not doing it with you. She looked at him for a long moment in which he could see every layer of her, the practical mind and the warm heart and the careful self-protection, and the thing underneath all of it that was just Dorothy, full and complete and sufficient. "Yes," she said, clearly and without hesitation. He kissed her, right there behind the counter of Finley's Seed and Dry Goods, with the coffee going cold on the counter behind her and the October light coming through the front window, and she kissed him back with both hands up against his chest, and then pulled back just far enough to look at him with bright eyes. "The shop keeps its name," she said. "Finley's is a better name than Donnelly's," he he agreed immediately. Easier to say. She laughed, the full laugh that he had been working to produce since the first day and still found to be one of the finest sounds he had ever heard. And he laughed with her. And the cold light of October in Kansas was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his 31 years. They married in the Redemption Creek Church on a Saturday in December of 1882, when the plains were dusted white and the air was clean and hard, and the church stove was going full and the whole town had come, because Dorothy Finley was a woman the town had decided to be proud of, and Daniel Donnelly had earned, in 6 months, a careful but genuine regard. Sheriff Malone stood up for Daniel. A woman named Clara Whitfield, who was Dorothy's closest friend in Redemption Creek, and who had kept a watchful eye on Daniel all fall and had eventually declared him acceptable, stood with Dorothy. There was a brief ceremony and a longer reception at Mrs. Haverson's, which was cleared of tables for the occasion, and Mrs. Haverson produced a wedding cake that was, Dorothy told her with complete sincerity, the finest thing she had ever eaten. The winter was quiet and close and very good. Dorothy had moved into better rooms at the back of the shop, expanded the year before, and Daniel brought to those rooms the 3 things he owned beyond his horse and his gear, which were 2 books and a hand-drawn map of Missouri that his mother had made for him when he was 9. And Dorothy looked at the map and asked him about every place on it, and he told her, which took 2 evenings and was the most he had spoken about Missouri in years. In the spring, a letter came from the U.S. Marshal's office informing Daniel that Wade Caswell had been indicted on 12 federal counts, that Reeves had indeed cooperated in exchange for a reduced sentence, and that Daniel's testimony might be needed at the trial, which was scheduled for the fall in Kansas City. He wrote back that he would be there. He felt no particular satisfaction at the news of Caswell's indictment, only a kind of settling, the way a house settles when the foundation is finally sound. Spring also brought Josiah Hartwell's seed contract, which Dorothy had mentioned to Greer in the previous year's standoff, and which came through with numbers that were even better than she had projected, and which meant she could hire an assistant for the shop for 3 days a week, which she did, in the person of a young woman named Agnes Polk, who was 17 and very quick, and who Dorothy took a particular interest in. Teaching her the accounts and the inventory system, and the principles of the seed, trade with the same thorough attention that Dorothy's father had once given her. "You're enjoying this," Daniel said one evening, watching Dorothy drill Agnes on the seed categories with the patient intensity of a born teacher. "I am," Dorothy said later, when Agnes had gone home and the shop was closing down for the evening. "My father taught me because he believed women could learn whatever was worth learning. I believed him, and then I had to prove it without a shop to practice in. Agnes doesn't have a shop, but she can learn the principles here and take them wherever she ends up." "You ever think about what you'd have been if you'd had more room?" he asked. She considered. "I'm not sure I mean that as a complaint exactly. I have the shop and I have you and I have a life that I built and chose. But sometimes—" She paused. "Sometimes I think about what it would mean if women could vote and could own property outright without all the legal complications, could make contracts in their own right without needing a husband's name on the paper. It would change everything." "It will," he said, because he believed it, and because it was the right thing to say, and also because he had spent enough time watching Dorothy work to understand at a cellular level how much was being wasted by a world that did not use half its people properly. "Not in time to matter much to me," she said. "It'll matter to Agnes," he said. She looked at him, and the look was warm and complicated and thoroughly his. "You're a good man, Daniel Donnelly," she said. "I'm working on it," he said, which was what he always said, and she always replied the same way, which was to take his hand and hold it, and she did, and they stood in the closing shop in the spring evening, and the creek was high with snowmelt, and the world outside the window was very green. In the summer of 1883, a year after Daniel had ridden into Redemption Creek, Dorothy told him she was expecting. He was very quiet for a moment in the way that was his, and then he looked at her and his face had an expression she had never seen on it before, something entirely undefended, something that was too much for his usual composure to contain, and she thought that of all the things she had learned about him in a year, she had not known that he would look like that, and it was the most wonderful thing she could have imagined learning. "Dorothy," he said, and his voice was not quite even. "I know," she said, because she understood what was in him, the disbelief that he was here, that he had this, that this was real. "Are you all right?" he asked, pulling himself together with the effort she could see. "I'm very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." He pulled her close, carefully, as if she might have become suddenly fragile, which she had to put a stop to within the week by pointing out with practical firmness that she was not made of glass, and planned to keep running the shop until the relevant day arrived, and would expect him to stop hovering about it. He heard her on this and did his best, with only occasional lapses that she found entirely forgivable. The pregnancy went well by the standards of the time, and Dorothy was delivered, in March of 1884, of a boy, which Daniel received with a stunned gratitude that lasted approximately 4 continuous days before he was able to resume normal speech patterns. The boy was named Thomas, after Dorothy's father, with Robert as a middle name, after Dorothy's first husband, which Daniel had suggested himself, which had moved Dorothy more than almost anything he had ever done. Thomas Finley Donnelly arrived into a world that was the shop and the rooms behind it, and the town of Redemption Creek, and 2 parents who were, by any reasonable assessment, deeply in love, and committed to making something good out of the materials the world had given them. Daniel testified in Kansas City in October of 1884 at the Caswell trial. He was gone for 2 weeks, and Dorothy managed the shop with Agnes's help and without complaint, and when he came back she met him at the edge of town in the wagon because she had known the stage schedule and had brought Thomas, who was 7 months old and had opinions about the autumn wind that he was expressing with volume. Daniel climbed down from the stage and took his son from Dorothy's arms and held him and looked at Dorothy over the baby's head with an expression that was everything he was, everything good and real and present, and she looked back at him the same way. "How did it go?" she said. "Caswell's going to prison for a long time," he said. "Reeves is already there, it's finished." She nodded. "Good," she said. "Are you all right?" "Yes," he said, and meant it in the deepest way, in the way that went back to everything that had led him here. 6 years of wrong choices, and 1 horse with a thrown shoe, and 1 woman with flour on her sleeve, and the good sense not to ride away when he found her. "I am very much all right." They drove back to town in the October afternoon, Thomas settled between them on the wagon seat, not sleeping but looking at the world with the absolute focused attention of a very young person encountering it fresh. And the creek was running gold in the autumn light, and the leaves were turning along the banks, and Redemption Creek was ahead of them, visible from the road. The white church steeple and the hotel sign, and the Finley seed and dry goods sign that Daniel could read from this distance, because he had long ago memorized its exact position and dimensions. He took Dorothy's hand, and she took it back, and they rode into town together in the fall light. The years that followed were built from ordinary things, the kind of ordinary things that are not ordinary at all when you are paying attention to them, which Daniel had learned to do. The shop grew. Dorothy added a small lending library in the back room, 10 books that the community could borrow and return, which became 20 and then 40, and became something that people in Redemption Creek talked about with the particular pride of a small community that has made something good happen. Agnes Polk ran the shop 3 days a week, and then 4. And then she had a young man who came around, and Dorothy advised her on the matter with the directness that had characterized all of her advice. And Agnes married well and stayed in Redemption Creek, and remained a presence in the shop and in Dorothy's life. Thomas learned to walk in the shop, between the seed display frames, which he reached at approximately the same height as the lowest shelf, and could therefore be trusted, at 20 months, to reorganize the spring seed section by some principle entirely his own. Dorothy reorganized it back and he reorganized it again, and this pattern continued for several months. In the spring of 1886, Dorothy told Daniel she was expecting again, and this second pregnancy produced, in December of that year, a daughter, who was named Alina, after a woman in one of Dorothy's books whose quality of character she admired. And Alina arrived with hair the color of her father's and her mother's directness fully installed from the first day, and the household adjusted. Daniel was a good father in the way that mattered, which was that he was present and attentive and treated his children as people of increasing competence and interest, which they responded to by becoming both. He told Thomas stories from Missouri, from the good years, and eventually, when Thomas was older, some measured truth from the harder years, because he believed in giving his children an accurate accounting of the world and of his own history. He stayed the deputy of Redemption Creek, and then, when Malone retired in 1887, he was appointed sheriff, which the town approved by the widest margin of any decision the town council had made in 5 years, which Malone told him with the closest thing to satisfaction that Malone ever expressed, which was a slight nod and an almost invisible smile. Dorothy told him the evening of the appointment, while they were putting the children to bed, and the house was in the gentle chaos of small children being settled, that she was proud of him, and she said it simply and directly, which was the only way she said anything, and he stopped what he was doing for a moment and looked at her, and felt the accumulated weight of everything that had brought him here. All the wrong roads and the terrible years and the one moment of grace when a shoe came off a horse's hoof at the right time in the right town. "I didn't earn that early," he said. "The pride." "No," she agreed, because she did not deal in comforting untruths. "But you've been earning it since. That's what matters." He crossed the room and kissed her, in the doorway of the children's room with Thomas asleep behind them and Alina working on it, and she put her hand on his face the way she had done since the first time he kissed her, and the gesture was so entirely hers, so specifically Dorothy, that it hit him the same way it always had, with the same force. There was a second daughter in 1889, named Frances, who arrived in July and was the image of Dorothy, and a second son in 1891, named James, for Deputy Marshal Whitmore, who had died in the line of duty the previous year, and whom Daniel had mourned with a quietness and a depth that was characteristic of the way he held loss now, not suppressed but held. The household was full and organized and alive in all the ways that matter. The shop continued. The lending library grew to 60 books in 1890, and Dorothy wrote a letter to the State Library Commission making the case for a formal town library in Redemption Creek, which was an argument she won, as she won most arguments, by being better prepared than everyone on the other side. The Redemption Creek Public Library opened in 1892 in a dedicated room donated by a prosperous farmer, who was deeply grateful for the seed contracts that Dorothy had helped him understand. And Dorothy served on its board and selected its initial inventory with the same focused intelligence she brought to everything she did. Daniel sat on the bench outside the sheriff's office on summer evenings and watched the town he kept, and was content in a way that he had not previously known was available to him. He had spent so many years understanding contentment as something other people had, something that required a different kind of life or a different kind of person, and he had discovered that the truth was simpler and more demanding than that. Contentment was the result of being where you were supposed to be, doing what you were supposed to do, with the person you were supposed to be with. You had to arrive at that by whatever road you arrived at it, including the wrong roads, which perhaps were not entirely wrong if they ended here. Dorothy came out of the shop one evening in the summer of 1893 and sat beside him on the bench, which she sometimes did when the accounts were done, and the children were occupied, and the evening was too good to stay inside. Thomas was 11, and had his father's eyes and his mother's quickness with numbers. Alina was 6 and had decided opinions about the seed display and had twice reorganized it according to her own principle, which was not so different from Thomas at 20 months, except that Alina's system had a legible logic that Dorothy had found herself almost persuaded by. Francis was 4 and relentlessly interested in everything. James was 2 and had not yet developed an organizational philosophy. "What are you thinking about?" Dorothy asked, sitting beside him with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the evening. "How much has happened," he said, "since that horse threw its shoe?" She turned to look at him. "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. Not anxiously, with the curiosity that was her natural register. He thought about it honestly because she deserved honesty above comfort. "The 6 years before," he said. "Some of what I did in them, Corey Brandt. The families whose land Caswell took that I didn't do enough to stop." He paused. "But the shoe, coming into town, no, not one moment." She looked at him steadily. "Neither do I," she said. "The apricots were good," he said. She laughed, sudden and full, the way she had been laughing with him for 11 years. "They were extremely good," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And the evening came down over Redemption Creek in all its wide Kansas splendor. All that horizon burning orange and gold, and the creek glittering to the south, and the familiar sounds of a town winding down for the day. Horses and voices, and the distant clang from the blacksmith, where Hollies was still working later than he should be. The church steeple caught the last light and held it, and somewhere behind them a child's voice was raised in protest about something, which was probably Francis, who protested with a vigor that Dorothy found simultaneously exhausting and privately admiring. Daniel Donnelly had ridden into this town with nothing. That was the plain truth of it. No plan, no prospects, no right to any of this. He had ridden with the wrong men for 6 years, and then he had stopped, and then he had ridden until his horse lost a shoe, and then he had found a woman with flour on her sleeve carrying a crate too heavy for one person, and he had been too plain a man to know that this was the moment, the one where the road changed from everything it had been into everything it would be. He knew it now. He had known it for a long time. He sat with his wife on the bench outside the sheriff's office in the last light of a summer evening in Redemption Creek, Kansas, in 1893, and the wind came off the plains the way it always did, steady and vast, and smelled of grass and distance, and it was exactly enough. The years continued to come, each one building on the last with the accumulating weight of a life genuinely lived. Wade Caswell died in a federal penitentiary in 1895, which Daniel received the news of with a quietness that said more than words would have. Thomas grew into a young man with his mother's business sense and his father's steady character, and went to a normal school in Topeka, and came back and taught in the Redemption Creek schoolhouse, which delighted Dorothy in the most unguarded way. Alina married a young farmer named William Hatch from east of town, whose family had been buying seed from Finley's for 10 years, which Dorothy considered a mark in his favor from the beginning. Frances grew up and announced at 15 that she intended to study medicine, which Dorothy supported with a specific and focused determination that included 3 letters to medical colleges, because Dorothy had spent her own life in a world that did not recognize what women could do, and she intended Frances to walk into a different kind of world armed with every available advantage. James, the youngest, had his mother's gift for organization and his father's patience, and was, at 12, already keeping the shop's simpler accounts with an accuracy that made Dorothy proud, and Agnes, who was still part of the shop in her 40s, shake her head with amused respect. Agnes herself had 2 daughters, both of whom could name the spring seed categories from memory by the time they were 8, which was Dorothy's doing, and which Agnes said was either an educational gift or a form of branding that she had not agreed to. Daniel's hair went gray at the temples by his mid-40s, which suited him, and he kept the sheriff's office for 20 years, until a younger man came along who was good and ready for it, and Daniel stepped aside with the clarity of someone who knows when a thing is done and when to be generous about it. He kept the deputy badge for another year, and then he put that down too, and the town gave him a supper and a certificate and an engraved pocket watch that he carried for the rest of his life. He spent the years after the sheriff's office doing what he had always found himself doing anyway, being useful where there was usefulness to be had. He helped farmers with fence repairs, and helped young men understand that the life of the outlaw was not the romantic proposition it was sometimes presented as, speaking from a credibility that nobody else in Redemption Creek possessed. He read widely and talked with Dorothy about everything he read, which they had done since the first years and which never became ordinary, because Dorothy's mind was one of those minds that does not become ordinary no matter how long you are in its company. One evening in the spring of 1900, when Thomas had his own family and Alina had 3 children and Francis was, against considerable odds, enrolled in a medical college in St. Louis, Daniel sat with Dorothy in the back room of the shop where she had always kept her books, the walls that had held 40 and now held nearly 100, and the children they still had at home were occupied, and the lamp was burning warm between them, and Dorothy was reading and he was reading, and the creak could be heard through the open window. He looked at her over his book. She was 51 years old and entirely herself, the same directness and the same organized intelligence and the same warmth that she had never performed, only offered, and there was gray in the auburn hair and lines at the corners of her eyes from the decades of smiling and squinting into the Kansas sun, and the lamp was very kind. She looked up and caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She looked at him for a moment with the same regard she had used on the first day, evaluating and direct. But the evaluation had 30+ years behind it now, and it had nothing to decide. Everything had long since been decided. "Come here," she said, and put her book down and made room beside her on the settee that was old and very comfortable. He came. He sat beside her and she put her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and she picked her book back up and he picked his up, and they sat in the lamplight in the back room of Finley's Seed and Dry Goods in Redemption Creek, Kansas, in the first year of a new century, and read. Outside, the creek ran south in the dark, the way it always had, the way it would continue to, carrying the snowmelt from the north and the rain from the high plains and the ordinary persistence of water that finds its way through stone and distance and time. And the town breathed around them in the spring night, the town that they had both, each in their way, made their own, and the window was open, and the lamp was burning, and there was nowhere else to be. He had ridden in with nothing and he had stayed. She had already been there and she had stayed too. That was the whole of it, and it was everything.